What if one of North America's longest minus-running trade battles was never really about lumber at all? What if the dispute that has stretched across for decades, survived multiple presidents, outlasted entire generations of workers, and repeatedly returned to the center of U.S. Canada relations was actually a story about something much larger? Because when most people hear the word softwood lumber dispute, they picture stacks of timber, logging trucks, or sawmills hidden deep inside Canadian forests. But policymakers see something entirely different. They see housing affordability, supply chains, manufacturing competitiveness, trade policy, and ultimately, the economic relationship between two of the world's closest trading partners. In early 2026, that relationship entered another difficult chapter. An American lumber industry organization publicly criticized what it described as billions of dollars in Canadian government support flowing toward the country's forestry sector. Too many producers south of the border. The announcement appeared to confirm an argument they had made for decades that government assistance continued giving Canadian lumber companies an unfair advantage in the American market. Canadian officials viewed the situation through a very different lens. From Ottawa and provincial capitals, the programs were presented not as market manipulation, but as emergency stabilization. No closures had accelerated. Investment had slowed. Communities built almost entirely around forestry were facing growing economic uncertainty. Support, officials argued, was intended to preserve employment and prevent long-term industrial decline rather than distort international competition. Those competing narratives reveal why the dispute has proven so difficult to resolve. Both sides believe they are protecting legitimate national interests, and both sides continue finding political support for their position. To understand why, it helps to step back from today's headlines. The softwood lumber dispute did not begin in 2026. It did not begin in the last decade. Its modern history reaches back more than 40 years, making it one of the longest minus-running trade disagreements anywhere in the developed world. At its center lies a surprisingly simple question. How should timber harvested from public forests be valued? In the United States, much commercial timber comes from privately owned land. Prices are largely determined through commercial transactions between private owners and forest companies operating in competitive markets. Canada follows a different model. Most commercially harvested forests are publicly owned by provincial governments. Rather than purchasing privately owned timber, companies pay fees commonly known as stumpage charges for the right to harvest trees from publicly managed forests. For decades, American producers have argued that these fees are set below true market value, allowing Canadian lumber producers to export products at artificially competitive prices. Canadian governments have consistently rejected that interpretation. Officials maintain that provincial forest management reflects Canada's long-standing public ownership system rather than any attempt to subsidize exports. International trade panels have, at various times, reached different conclusions depending on the specific measures under review. Yet despite numerous legal rulings, negotiations, and temporary agreements, the broader disagreement has never completely disappeared. Instead, each new economic cycle tends to reopen familiar arguments under updated political circumstances. By 2026, those arguments had become increasingly expensive. Over recent years, Canadian lumber producers accumulated billions of dollars in duties while exporting products into the United States. Those funds remain tied to ongoing trade proceedings, limiting the industry's ability to reinvest capital into equipment modernization, mill upgrades, workforce development, and community expansion. For forestry dependent regions, that financial pressure extends well beyond company balance sheets. Entire local economies often depend on the continued operation of sawmills. When investment slows, employment opportunities decline. Young workers leave. Supporting businesses suffer. Communities that developed around forestry begin confronting long-term demographic and economic challenges. Meanwhile, the United States faces its own structural reality. Domestic production alone has struggled to satisfy total softwood lumber demand. Imports, particularly from Canada, continue playing an important role in supplying American construction markets. That creates an unusual political balance. Policies designed to support domestic producers may simultaneously increase costs for industries that depend upon imported lumber. Home builders frequently find themselves caught between those competing objectives. Their primary concern is rarely the legal structure of stumpage systems or international trade law. Instead, they focus on the far more immediate question: can homes still be built at prices consumers can afford? That question became increasingly important as higher borrowing costs placed additional pressure on housing markets across North America. Builders already faced elevated financing expenses, labor shortages, insurance costs, and ongoing supply-chain adjustments. Every additional source of uncertainty complicated project planning. Although lumber represents only one component of residential construction, fluctuations in availability, pricing, and import policy contribute to broader cost calculations throughout the industry. Consequently, the softwood dispute gradually evolved beyond forestry itself. It became closely connected with housing policy, inflation, infrastructure investment, and broader economic competitiveness. Another factor further complicated the picture. Multiple trade measures began overlapping. Traditional anti-minus dumping and countervailing duties remained under periodic review. Additional tariffs introduced under separate legal authorities added another layer of uncertainty. Rather than confronting a single policy, producers, importers, distributors, and builders increasingly operated within several simultaneous regulatory frameworks. Each adjustment influenced investment decisions. Each administrative review altered expectations. Each announcement introduced new uncertainty into markets that already struggled to forecast future costs. Against that background, Canada's financial support programs attracted significant attention. To critics, they represented another example of government intervention preventing normal market adjustment. To supporters, they reflected the practical reality that forestry communities required temporary assistance while navigating one of the industry's most difficult periods in decades. The disagreement was never simply about one funding announcement. It reflected two fundamentally different views regarding the relationship between government, industry, and economic stability. And perhaps more importantly, it highlighted how a dispute originally centered on timber harvesting that expanded into a much broader conversation about industrial policy, supply-minus chain resilience, and North America's economic future. The financial support that attracted so much attention in Washington did not appear overnight. Instead, it emerged through a series of federal and provincial measures introduced as conditions inside Canada's forestry sector continued deteriorating. Rather than presenting one large rescue package, governments gradually expanded financing programs, credit facilities, worker assistance, and temporary policy adjustments designed to keep companies operating while trade uncertainty persisted. From Ottawa's perspective, the objective was straightforward: prevent a temporary trade dispute from becoming permanent industrial decline. Much of the federal response focused on liquidity rather than direct subsidies. Access to financing became increasingly important as companies continued operating while significant amounts of capital remained tied up by ongoing trade measures. Officials argued that maintaining cash flow would allow mills to continue paying workers, maintaining equipment, and preserving production capacity until market conditions improved. Provincial governments faced an even more immediate challenge. In regions such as British Columbia, forestry is more than an export industry. It supports local transportation networks, equipment suppliers, contractors, retailers, schools, and entire communities whose economic health depends upon continued timber production. When a large sawmill slows production, the effects spread far beyond the facility itself. Local businesses lose customers. Municipal tax revenues decline. Young workers begin relocating elsewhere in search of employment. Communities that have relied upon forestry for generations suddenly face questions about their long-term future. Support programs therefore extended beyond businesses alone. Worker retraining initiatives, employment assistance, regional development programs, and temporary financial relief all became part of a broader effort to stabilize local economies during a period of prolonged uncertainty. Critics, however, viewed the situation differently. American lumber organizations argued that government intervention prevented market forces from functioning as intended. If companies experiencing financial pressure continued receiving public support, they argued, production capacity would remain higher than market conditions justified, placing additional pressure on competitors operating without similar assistance. This disagreement reflects one of the oldest debates in international trade. When does legitimate economic stabilization become market distortion? There is rarely universal agreement. The answer often depends upon where one sits within the supply chain. Forestry companies emphasize production. Governments emphasize employment. Builders emphasize affordability. Consumers emphasize prices. Each perspective captures part of the broader picture. Housing provides perhaps the clearest example of those competing priorities. American home builders have repeatedly warned that uncertainty surrounding lumber imports complicates long-term planning. The issue extends beyond the price of individual boards. Residential construction depends upon predictable supply chains. Developers negotiate contracts months before projects begin. Material availability influences financing decisions, labor scheduling, and project timelines. When import policies change unexpectedly, businesses frequently respond by building larger inventories, delaying purchases, or revising budgets to account for additional uncertainty. Those adjustments carry their own economic costs. Yet an interesting development occurred during 2025 and into 2026. Despite elevated trade barriers, lumber prices did not consistently move upward in the dramatic fashion many observers had anticipated. Several factors contributed to that outcome. Some producers accelerated shipments before higher duties took effect. Meanwhile, broader housing demand softened as elevated borrowing costs discouraged some buyers from entering the market. Increased supply and slower construction activity combined to ease upward pressure on lumber prices, even while trade tensions continued intensifying. That created an unusual contradiction. Supporters of tariffs argued that domestic producers still required protection. Builders responded that broader construction costs continued rising even if lumber prices alone were not driving every increase. Both arguments contained elements of truth. Modern housing costs result from numerous interconnected pressures rather than any single commodity. Financing expenses, insurance, labor availability, transportation, building materials, land prices, regulatory requirements. Each contributes to the final price paid by homebuyers. Trade policy therefore influences housing indirectly as well as directly. The dispute also arrives during an especially significant period for North American trade policy. In 2026, the three governments participating in the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement began preparing for the agreement's scheduled review process, although the review covers numerous industries including manufacturing, digital commerce, and automotive production. Softwood lumber remains one of the most politically sensitive issues likely to receive attention. That does not necessarily mean an immediate breakthrough is approaching. History encourages caution. For decades, the dispute has followed a remarkably consistent pattern: new duties, legal challenges, administrative reviews, temporary agreements, renewed disagreements. Then another cycle begins. Entire generations of executives, politicians, and forestry workers have experienced variations of the same sequence. Each round produces different numbers. Very few fundamentally change the underlying disagreement. Still, some analysts believe the current moment differs in one important respect. The discussion has gradually expanded beyond forestry itself. Supply minus chain resilience, housing affordability, industrial competitiveness, regional employment, national economic security. These broader concerns increasingly overlap with traditional trade policy. As a result, resolving the dispute may now require addressing multiple economic objectives simultaneously rather than focusing exclusively on lumber. Whether that proves possible remains uncertain. Trade negotiations rarely produce permanent solutions when both sides believe important structural interests remain at stake. Yet neither side benefits from indefinite uncertainty. Canadian producers seek greater investment confidence. American builders seek more predictable supply conditions. Communities on both sides of the border seek stable employment. Governments seek economic growth without sacrificing domestic political support. Reconciling those objectives has challenged policymakers for decades. It may continue doing so for years to come. Perhaps that is the most remarkable aspect of the softwood lumber dispute. Despite lasting more than 40 years, despite surviving changing governments, despite countless legal decisions, the central questions remain strikingly familiar. How should natural resources be valued? What constitutes fair competition? When should governments intervene? And how much economic uncertainty can industries absorb before long-term investment begins moving elsewhere? Those questions extend well beyond lumber. They increasingly define modern international trade itself. Because in today's economy, supply chains are measured not only by efficiency, but by resilience. Not only by cost, but by predictability. And perhaps that explains why a disagreement over forests continues attracting attention far beyond logging towns and sawmills. The real issue is no longer simply who sells the most lumber. It is whether North America can build a trading relationship capable of balancing industrial competitiveness, affordable housing, and long-term economic stability at the same time. After more than 4 decades, that remains the challenge. And perhaps the greatest risk is not another tariff, or another legal dispute, but allowing uncertainty itself to become the permanent foundation upon which future investment decisions are made. Because once industries begin planning around instability instead of expecting resolution, breaking the cycle becomes far more difficult than continuing it.